Welcome to Muzi Horror World, and hello to tonight's terrifying tale. If you're ready to dive into the supernatural world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss any of our spine-chilling stories. We have a lot more eerie tales coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single one. If you enjoyed our ghostly tales, please make sure to like this video because it helps us bring more creepy content to you. And as always, we love hearing from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. So, sit back, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself for tonight's haunting story, because what's about to happen, you won't believe. Story number 1. There's a legend that haunts the dark corners of the city, whispered between those who have heard it, but never lived to tell the whole story. It's a story that begins with the sound of an old bus engine, a bus that should never have been there, a bus that nobody remembers ever boarding. The ghost bus, as it's known, makes its rounds in the dead of night, picking up passengers who never reach their destination. People who vanish without a trace, lost in a one-way trip that leads nowhere. You've probably heard the stories. A lone traveler waiting for a bus late at night, eyes glazed with exhaustion, only to see an old, weathered bus pulling up, its lights dim and flickering. The doors creak open, and an unnerving chill fills the air. For a moment, there's silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. It's as if the world itself holds its breath. The passengers, all strangely quiet, sit motionless, their faces too pale, their eyes too empty. The bus driver's face is hidden in shadow, his presence somehow too still, too calm. And when the doors close behind you, there's no turning back. You can't shake the feeling that something isn't right as the bus drives on, taking you down streets you don't recognize, streets that seem to stretch on forever. The city outside is a blur of shadows, distorted by the dim lights of the bus. No one speaks, no one moves, and soon enough, you start to realize that this isn't a regular ride. The bus isn't taking you home. It's taking you somewhere else. But where? And what happens to those who ride the ghost bus? The answers may be lost in the silence that fills the vehicle, but one thing is certain. Once you board, there's no getting off. Stay with me as I tell you the full story of the ghost bus, a tale of passengers who board a ride from which they never return. What happens when the bus takes you on that one-way trip? Keep watching. You may never look at your late-night bus ride the same way again. Jason had never thought much about public transport, but on that particular night, as the clock struck midnight, he found himself at the bus stop, waiting for the last bus home. It had been a long day, and he was eager to get to his apartment, but the usual routine of catching his ride had been disrupted. The streets were eerily quiet, the world around him swallowed by an oppressive fog that had crept in from nowhere. The lampposts flickered ominously, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. Jason checked his watch again. It was well past the usual time for the last bus. He considered calling a cab, but decided against it. He'd just wait a few more minutes. As he sighed and pulled his jacket tighter around his body, a low rumbling sound broke the silence. At first, he thought it was a passing car, but the noise grew louder, closer, and unmistakably like the sound of an approaching bus. Turning his head, Jason saw it. An old, dilapidated bus that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Its headlights were dim, and its body was rusted, with peeling paint that barely revealed the faded words of its route number. The bus wasn't a model Jason recognized. Its shape was a strange mix of something that looked both ancient and modern, like a relic from another time. The doors opened with a mechanical groan, the sound of the hinges creaking in the quiet night air. No one was there to greet him, no driver in sight. But Jason, unsure of why he felt compelled, climbed aboard. As soon as he stepped inside, a wave of cold air washed over him. It was unnatural, almost as if the bus had been sitting in a deep freezer, waiting for passengers. The lights inside flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the empty seats. Jason hesitated, but took a seat near the back, still unsure whether the bus was real or just a figment of his exhausted imagination. There were no other passengers at first, but as he settled in, he noticed something odd. The seats, though unoccupied, seemed too perfect, as though no one had sat in them for years. The atmosphere felt thick, as if time itself had stopped aboard this strange vessel. The bus started moving without warning. There was no sudden lurch or jolt, just a smooth, slow acceleration. Jason glanced around nervously, but the few other passengers in the bus remained motionless, their heads down, eyes half closed, and their bodies stiff, like mannequins frozen in time. They were unnervingly still, not speaking, not moving. The silence was deafening. Jason pulled his jacket tighter, feeling a cold shiver running through him. He tried to look out the window, but the streets outside were not familiar. None of the landmarks he knew were visible. The buildings blurred past him, their shapes indistinct through the thick fog that seemed to follow the bus wherever it went. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a street that looked like this. And yet, the bus kept moving, its engine humming steadily. The hours seemed to blend together in the bus's eerie rhythm. Jason felt his mind start to wander, as if the very air inside the bus was making him groggy. He thought of the people he'd left behind at home, his friends, his family, but none of them seemed real anymore. The longer he sat in the bus, the more distant his thoughts became, as if the bus was pulling him away from everything he knew. The faces of the other passengers began to blur, their features indistinguishable. They weren't human, not in any meaningful way. They were hollow-eyed figures, staring ahead but not truly seeing anything. Jason tried to speak, but his words were swallowed by the thick silence, and then he realized something far more disturbing. No one was getting off. The stops were passing by, but every time the doors opened, there was no one outside, no one to board. The bus was always empty, save for the lifeless passengers who never moved. "Where are we going?" Jason asked, his voice trembling as he looked around at the unmoving crowd. No one answered. Not a single soul spoke. The bus driver's seat remained empty, even though the bus continued to travel at an unsettling pace. Jason's heart pounded as he realized something was terribly wrong. This was no ordinary ride, and there was no turning back. He tried to get up, to leave, but his body felt heavy, like his feet were glued to the floor. His legs refused to obey, and he stumbled back into his seat. The fog outside thickened, blurring everything in its path. The bus wasn't going anywhere familiar. It was going through something. But what? Was this a nightmare? Was he hallucinating? But the truth was far worse than he could ever have imagined. Slowly, the familiar streets turned into warped shapes. The buildings outside seemed to twist and stretch as if the entire city were being bent and reshaped by some unseen force. There was something deeply wrong with the way everything around him distorted, as if the world was being swallowed by the fog, sinking into an abyss. Jason's breathing grew shallow, and he gripped the armrests, his knuckles turning white. His eyes darted back to the passengers. They hadn't moved at all. Their eyes were vacant, staring straight ahead, their faces expressionless, and yet Jason could feel them staring at him. They were watching him. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, the bus slowed, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. There were figures standing on the street, silhouettes in the distance. At first, they seemed far away, But as the bus moved closer, he realized they were standing still in the fog, just watching. Watching the bus. Watching him. Their eyes were glowing faintly, like the reflection of headlights in the dark. Jason shuddered as their gaze locked onto him. There was something hauntingly familiar about them, though he couldn't place it. The bus came to a halt, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Jason stood frozen, his heart thundering in his chest. But the street outside was empty, nothing but fog and shadow. No one outside, no one to greet him. But that feeling of being watched grew stronger. His legs moved of their own accord as he stumbled toward the door, desperate for escape. But the instant his hand reached the handle, he stopped. A voice, cold and distant, echoed through the air, filling his mind. "You cannot leave." Jason froze, unable to move. He felt something close behind him, a presence, a cold, overwhelming force that pressed in on him, whispering in his ear. He turned, but there was no one there. Just the empty, silent bus. He heard the engine rumble back to life. The doors closed with a final, ominous thud. Jason was trapped. He was bound to this endless ride with no end, no destination. The fog swirled outside as the bus continued on its unending journey through the unknown, with Jason now just another soul lost in the endless cycle of the ghost bus. The bus would never stop. It would never return, and neither would he. The ghost bus has been said to roam the streets, always appearing when least expected, picking up those who unknowingly board. Once you step inside, there's no going back. And for those who do, the ride never ends. It's a one-way trip to somewhere far darker than any of us could imagine. The ghost bus, it's waiting for the next passenger. Will it be you? Story number 2. Have you ever received a call in the middle of the night from an unknown number, only to answer and hear nothing but silence on the other end? Your heart skips a beat. You wait for a voice, but it never comes. You try to call back, but the number doesn't exist. It doesn't even show up on your phone's call history. It's as though the call came from nowhere, and yet, somehow, it felt too real to ignore. Imagine this. You're sitting at home. The only sound is the ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, your phone rings, its screen lighting up with a strange, unfamiliar number. You hesitate. It's late, and the number doesn't seem to belong to anyone you know. But you pick up anyway, drawn by something you can't explain. The phone clicks, and then nothing. A strange, unsettling silence fills the air, stretching on, second after second. You speak into the phone, asking if anyone is there, but only the void answers. You check your phone again. The call is still active, but there's no sound, no voice, no breath, just silence. Panic begins to rise in your chest. You hang up, but there's no record of the call, no incoming number, no history. It's as though it never happened, but you know it did. The phone call left behind an eerie feeling that lingers, like a shadow you can't shake off. And that's when you begin to wonder. What if this call isn't just some glitch in the system? What if it's something else? Something trying to get your attention? Something that isn't human? Could it be a warning? Or something far worse? Now, imagine if that call came again, and this time, the silence might not be the only thing you hear. Let's dive into the mystery of the silent phone call, a call from a number that doesn't exist, and the chilling story of those who received it. It was a dark, stormy night when Daniel first received the call. He had been working late at the office, the rain tapping incessantly against the window, and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above his desk was the only sound in the otherwise silent room. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A glance at the screen revealed an unknown number. He hesitated. Who could be calling him this late? His friends and family were all accounted for, and no one ever reached out to him at this hour. Still, his curiosity got the better of him, and he answered the call. "Hello?" Daniel said, his voice a little hoarse from the long hours of work. There was no response, only silence. He waited for a few seconds, thinking maybe it was a prank or a wrong number. Then, just as he was about to hang up, he thought he heard something. A faint, barely audible whisper, like someone breathing heavily, just on the other side of the line. He leaned in, straining to hear. "Hello? Is someone there?" he asked again, but his words only echoed back to him in the stillness. Nothing else came, just silence. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He pulled the phone away from his ear and checked the screen again. There was nothing unusual. The call was still active, but the number wasn't even listed. It wasn't a typical unknown number or blocked number. It was just empty. An unsettling feeling crawled up his spine. He didn't hang up. He stared at the phone, as if willing it to give him some sort of explanation, but it didn't. He finally ended the call, but when he checked the phone's call log, the number had completely vanished. There was no trace of the call, no record, no missed call, no voicemail. It was as though it had never happened. Shaken, Daniel convinced himself it was just a glitch, maybe some issue with the phone software. But the unease didn't leave him. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He tried to ignore it, but the experience haunted him, like a dark cloud he couldn't escape. The next evening, as he sat on his couch, trying to unwind after work, his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen. The same unknown number was calling him. His heart skipped a beat. This time, he didn't hesitate. He answered. "Hello?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling now. He was ready for silence again, but instead, he heard something else. It was the same whisper, but it was louder now, more distinct. It wasn't just a breath. It was a voice, a soft, drawn-out voice that sent chills down his spine. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, as if someone was struggling to speak, but Daniel could hear it clearly, just the same. He froze, his heart racing in his chest. The call was silent for a moment, and then the voice spoke again, this time in a low, desperate tone. "Please, help me." Daniel's pulse quickened, his mind racing. Who was this? What did they want? And how could they possibly know his name? The fear rose inside him like a tidal wave, making him feel trapped, suffocated. The voice didn't sound like it was coming from the phone. No, it felt like it was in his mind, like the words were planted there, pressing against the walls of his thoughts. He couldn't explain it, but it didn't feel real. Suddenly, the voice stopped. The phone line went completely silent, but Daniel's fingers hovered over the phone, unwilling to hang up. There was something wrong, something unnatural about the call. He tried calling the number back, but the screen went blank. The call history had no trace of it, as though the number had disappeared into thin air. Daniel's anxiety only grew after that. He felt as though he was being watched, as though the phone was somehow linked to something beyond the living world. The call had left a mark on him, one that he couldn't erase. And the worst part? He knew he wasn't the only one. Others had started to tell similar stories of receiving strange calls from numbers that didn't exist. They described the same voices, the same desperate pleas for help. Days passed, and the calls became more frequent. Each time, the voice became clearer. Each time, the message became more urgent. "Help me," it would say. Sometimes it would whisper other words. "Run," "Don't trust them," or simply, "It's too late." Daniel tried everything he could to block the number, to stop the calls, but nothing worked. Every time, The number would change, and every time, the voice would return, growing more distorted, more desperate. It was as if he was being drawn into something that wanted him to listen. The silence between the calls seemed to stretch on forever, but the moments of sound, those whispered voices, were getting closer. He could feel them in his bones. The walls seemed to close in on him. He was no longer just hearing the voices in the phone. He started hearing them when he walked through his apartment. He would be alone in the bathroom, brushing his teeth, and he would hear a whisper from behind him. He would wake in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, and the whispers would be there, waiting. Desperate for answers, Daniel researched the phone calls. He learned that there were rumors of such calls, stretching back decades. Stories of people who had received mysterious, untraceable calls from numbers that didn't exist. Some claimed it was a supernatural phenomenon. Others thought it was some kind of government experiment gone wrong. But the one thing all the stories had in common was that the people who received these calls were never the same afterward. They changed. Something in them snapped. One night, the calls stopped, at least for a while. Daniel thought he was free. He began to think that maybe it had all been a figment of his imagination, that his mind had been playing tricks on him. He tried to sleep, but the rest he so desperately needed never came. Then, a new call came. It wasn't a voice he recognized. It wasn't the whispering, desperate tone he had grown used to. This time, there was something different. The phone rang, and when Daniel picked it up, there was no whisper. There was no help. There was only one word: run. It wasn't a voice, not a whisper. It was a scream. And it wasn't from the phone. It was from behind him. Daniel turned around, his heart in his throat, but the room was empty, or so it seemed. And that's when he realized the call never stopped. It was inside him now. It was never just a phone call. It was a warning. And soon, Daniel would discover that there was no escaping the voice on the other end of the line. It had always been there, watching, waiting, calling. Story number 3. Have you ever been driving down a quiet road, the night stretching on endlessly ahead, when you see a figure standing by the side of the highway? A person in need of a ride, perhaps someone who could be stranded or lost. It's a normal sight, and most people, driven by a sense of kindness, would offer a lift. But what if, after picking up that hitchhiker, you realize something is terribly wrong? What if, halfway through the ride, they vanish without a trace, leaving you with nothing but an empty seat beside you and a deep sense of unease in your heart? This story is one that many people have heard, but no one can explain. It's a tale that has haunted roads, highways, and sleepy towns for generations. The vanishing hitchhiker is a ghostly figure appearing on the side of the road, only to vanish before reaching their destination. But who is this mysterious person? Why do they appear? And why do they always disappear? What dark force ties them to the road? And what happens to those who are unlucky enough to encounter them? Imagine you're driving home after a long day, tired, eager to reach the comfort of your own bed, when you spot them, standing there in the rain or on a dark, deserted stretch of road. You pull over, feeling a little uneasy, but thinking nothing of it. You're just helping someone in need. But as you drive on, the air grows heavier, the atmosphere more tense. And then, in an instant, the hitchhiker is gone, leaving behind nothing but the strange feeling that something's not quite right. By the time you reach your destination, you begin to question your own reality. Was the hitchhiker ever really there at all? Was it just your imagination? Or did you unknowingly pick up a ghost? Stick around as we uncover the chilling story of the vanishing hitchhiker and the mysteries that surround them. Mark had always been a sensible man. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, at least, not until that night. The night that changed everything he thought he knew about the world. It was late, and the rain had started to fall steadily, tapping against the windshield of his car like a constant drumbeat. Mark had been working overtime at the office and was eager to get home, the warmth of his bed calling him like a distant memory. The road stretched out before him, empty and desolate, as he drove through a quiet stretch on the outskirts of town. The headlights of his car illuminated the wet pavement, and the fog rolling over the fields gave everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. As Mark rounded a bend in the road, he saw her, a figure standing on the side of the road, drenched by the rain, her long hair hanging limp around her face. She wore a faded blue dress, soaked through, and looked out of place on the desolate stretch of highway. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't the type to pick up strangers, especially not in the middle of nowhere at night. But something about the sight of her, so alone and vulnerable, pulled at his heartstrings. He slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" he called out, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling bubbling in his chest. The woman didn't say anything at first, but then she nodded, her hair hanging in wet strands around her face. There was something unsettling about her eyes, deep and distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the car. Mark didn't question it. He unlocked the door, and the woman slid into the passenger seat without a word, her wet clothes making a faint rustling sound as she moved. "Where are you headed?" Mark asked, trying to make small talk, to break the silence that felt so thick in the car. "Just up the road," she whispered softly, barely audible. "To Mill Road?" Mark glanced at her briefly, trying to gauge her reaction. Mill Road was just a few miles away, a dead-end street that led into the woods. Strange, Mark thought, since there was nothing there. No houses, no shops, just trees and the occasional old farmhouse. "All right," he said, putting the car back in gear and driving on. He tried to ignore the unease crawling over his skin as they continued down the road. The rain had turned into a downpour now, the wipers struggling to keep up with the sheets of water sliding down the windshield. The road was slick and treacherous, and Mark found himself gripping the wheel tighter with every turn. The woman sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. Mark wasn't the type to talk much, but the silence was suffocating, so he tried again. "What's at Mill Road?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to him slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You'll see soon enough," she said cryptically. Mark's stomach tightened. Her voice was soft and distant, as if she were speaking from another time, another place. He tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up his spine. Maybe she was just a little odd, but that was no reason to be frightened. As the minutes passed, the road grew darker. The streetlights were fewer and farther between, the only illumination coming from the headlights of Mark's car and the occasional flash of lightning. There was something deeply unsettling about the entire atmosphere, like the world was holding its breath. He tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman sitting beside him. Who was she? Why was she out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain? Finally, they reached the turnoff for Mill Road, a narrow path leading into a forest. Mark slowed the car, his grip tightening on the wheel. Something didn't feel right. He glanced at the woman, but she was no longer looking at him. Her face was turned toward the window, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "Here's Mill Road," Mark said, his voice shaky. The woman didn't respond. She just stared out into the night, her face emotionless. He continued driving down the road, the trees crowding in closer on either side. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he looked over at the woman again, his heart dropped into his stomach. She was gone. In the blink of an eye, the passenger seat was empty. Mark slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop on the side of the road. He spun around, his eyes scanning every inch of the car, but there was no sign of her. The door hadn't been opened. The seatbelt was still buckled. She had simply vanished. His breath caught in his throat as he frantically looked outside, hoping to see her standing on the side of the road, waiting for him to return. But there was nothing. No woman. No sign of movement. The only sound was the rain, pounding against the car in a steady rhythm. Mark's heart raced as his mind tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined it? Was he so tired that he'd hallucinated the whole thing? He could still feel the weight of her presence in the car, her cold, distant gaze, and the strange sense of inevitability in her words. The unease in his chest deepened as he backed the car up, his hands trembling. He drove slowly back down Mill Road, searching the trees, the ditches, even the darkness beyond the headlights. But there was no trace of her. No footsteps, no sign of life. She was gone. The next day, Mark visited the local diner, still shaken by the events of the previous night. He was sitting down with a coffee, trying to calm his nerves, when he overheard a conversation at a nearby table. A couple was talking about the road he had driven down the night before, and they mentioned something that sent a chill through Mark's bones. "They say there's a ghost that haunts Mill Road," the man said. "A woman who asks for a ride, only to disappear before anyone can get her to her destination. People say she was in a car accident years ago, and now she's forever trapped on that road, waiting for someone to take her home." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, unable to stop himself. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman at the table looked up at him, her expression sad. "They say no one knows. She's just gone. But her ghost still asks for rides, still disappears before anyone can help her. It's like she's stuck in time, lost on that road forever." Mark's hands trembled as he set down his coffee. He didn't need to hear more. He already knew. The hitchhiker from last night. She was the one. The vanishing hitchhiker, forever seeking a ride that would never lead her to the end of her journey. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Mark couldn't escape the feeling that he hadn't just met a ghost. He had met someone trapped, someone who had been waiting for far longer than he could comprehend. And as he drove home that night, the road seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows just a little darker than usual, as if he wasn't the only one out there. And deep down, he knew he would never forget the woman who vanished from the seat beside him. Story number 4. Imagine you're standing at the entrance of a dark tunnel, so deep and long that you can't see the end. The air feels heavy, and a strange pull tugs at you, drawing you toward the unknown. You're not alone. There are others around you, too, all looking lost and confused, just like you. You feel an eerie silence surrounding you, broken only by the distant echoes of footsteps that might not even be your own. Now, picture this. No matter how far you walk, the tunnel never seems to end. Every turn, every step, only leads to more darkness, more uncertainty. And as you push forward, it becomes clear. The tunnel isn't just a path through the earth, it's a place for the lost. It doesn't let go. The further you go, the more disoriented you become. Your mind starts to play tricks on you, showing you flashes of places you've never been, people you've never met. Time no longer exists here. Every direction feels like the same place. The same footsteps you hear aren't your own, but someone else's, someone who has been lost much longer than you. What if you found yourself in a place where there was no escape? A place where every turn you took only led deeper into the abyss? Would you be able to resist the urge to keep going? Or would you fall victim to the pull of the endless tunnel? And once you're in, what if you could never find your way out again? In tonight's story, we venture into a place where time is irrelevant, and the very walls seem to whisper the names of those who've wandered too far. Get ready to explore the endless tunnel, a place where the lost vanish, and the only way out is never knowing if you'll find it. Michael had been driving for hours, the road twisting and turning through the thick, foggy night. He'd been on this route many times, but tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with moisture, the rain tapping softly against the windshield as his headlights flickered through the dense fog. Then, he saw it, the tunnel. At first, he thought it was just another underpass, but as he drew closer, he noticed something unsettling about it. It wasn't marked on the map, and the road sign, which should have warned him about the tunnel, was completely gone. The entrance was just there, dark, wide, and inviting. The flickering lights that should have illuminated the tunnel's mouth were out. Everything about it seemed off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Still, something urged him forward. He had driven long enough. The empty road, the loneliness of the night, the promise of an escape from the endless stretch of highway, it all led him to this moment. A strange pull guided him into the dark, and he followed it, taking the left turn that led him toward the entrance of the tunnel. As his tires hit the wet ground inside, the car seemed to stutter, as though the tunnel itself was resisting his arrival. The walls on either side loomed large, curving into darkness, but Michael couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. Maybe it was the promise of reaching his destination quicker. Maybe it was the isolation, but he decided to push forward. The sound of the engine was swallowed by the thick silence, and the deeper he drove, the more unsettling it became. The light from his headlights flickered, dimming slightly, as if the tunnel itself were trying to drown out his presence. He pressed his foot on the gas, urging the car to move faster, but it felt as though the tunnel was stretching endlessly in front of him. He checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see the exit, but there was nothing. The opening had disappeared behind him. He slowed down and looked ahead. There was no sign of the tunnel's end. There were no turns, no exits. The tunnel stretched on, the same as before. He turned on his high beams, thinking the lights had dimmed too much, but it didn't make a difference. The tunnel refused to end. Michael's stomach twisted in discomfort. How long had he been driving? It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. He glanced down at the dashboard. The clock had stopped moving. The seconds had frozen. His heart pounded harder with each passing moment, and his mind began to race. What was happening? He turned the wheel sharply, trying to make a U-turn, but the car refused to respond. The steering felt stiff, as if the tunnel itself had a hold of it, refusing to let him leave. The walls seemed to close in on him. He slammed his foot on the brake, but the car didn't slow down. The speedometer remained stuck at a constant speed, no matter what he did. He looked out the window, trying to see if the world outside had changed. But there was nothing, just endless darkness, stretching into infinity. No stars, no moon, just the oppressive weight of the tunnel, which seemed to pulse with an eerie life of its own. The walls around him looked too smooth, too perfect, too unnatural. His eyes began to play tricks on him. He saw shadows shifting within the walls. Figures, faces. He blinked, but they weren't gone. They were there, watching him. His heart pounded faster. Was he hallucinating? The shadows seemed to move closer, stretching along the smooth stone, reaching out toward him. Panic began to rise within him, and he finally slammed the car into reverse. He pressed the pedal to the metal, desperate to escape. But no matter how far he backed up, the tunnel stretched before him, growing longer, more suffocating. The whispers started then, soft at first, like wind brushing through the cracks in the walls. At first, Michael couldn't make out the words, but then the whispers grew louder, clearer. "Don't go. It's too late. You're already lost." He gasped and slammed his foot on the brake, hearing the tires screech, but the car wasn't stopping. It was as if the tunnel itself was pulling him deeper. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead of him, standing in the middle of the tunnel. A woman with long, dark hair, dressed in tattered clothes. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his breath catching in his throat. What was she doing here, in the middle of nowhere, in this endless void? He slowed the car, unsure of what to do. He rolled the window down, calling out to her. "Hey, are you okay? Are you lost too?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him, her mouth stretched into a twisted smile, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. As Michael reached for the door handle, the woman raised her hand, as if to signal him to stop. But before he could react, she disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. Michael sat frozen in shock, his heart racing, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He looked ahead, hoping for an exit, hoping to see a light, anything that could lead him out of this madness. But there was nothing, just more darkness, stretching endlessly. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "You're never leaving. You're already one of us." Michael tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the tunnel had swallowed his voice. The walls around him seemed to press in tighter, suffocating him. He could feel the weight of the tunnel, the pull of its endless darkness, slowly consuming him. His eyes burned with tears, his vision blurring, as if the tunnel was draining him of everything: time, energy, sanity. He looked down at the dashboard again, but the clock was still frozen. Time had stopped, and he was stuck, trapped in this endless, infinite maze. And as Michael's mind slipped further into panic, he realized the terrible truth. The tunnel was never going to end. There was no way out, no escape. It was a place for the lost, a place that kept you forever, stretching endlessly into the dark. With his last ounce of strength, Michael turned the steering wheel, desperate for any way out. But the more he tried, the deeper he sank into the tunnel's grip. The walls closed in on him. And then, as the last breath of air left his lungs, the whispers in the darkness said, one final time, "You're one of us now. Welcome home." Story number 5. Have you ever walked past a house on a quiet street at night and noticed a single candle flickering in the window? You've probably wondered about the story behind it, the meaning of that small, solitary light in the darkness. In most cases, it's just a decoration, a warm glow against the night. But in some places, the candle has a far deeper, darker significance. This is the story of a candle that was lit for someone who never returned. A candle that still burns to this very day, years after the one it was meant for disappeared without a trace. It's a flame that refuses to die, no matter how much time passes, because the person it was meant for never found their way back. It's a vigil for the lost, a reminder that some souls never find their way home, and sometimes the living are left to wait forever. Some believe that the candle holds the spirit of the one who's gone, flickering in the window as if waiting for a door to open, a step to be heard, or the promise of a return that will never come. Others claim that it's the soul of the one who lit the candle, the one left behind, who cannot move on, bound by the light they refuse to extinguish. The stories vary, but one thing is certain. The candle in the window is never just a candle. It's a symbol of love, loss, and the impossible hope that the one who's gone will one day return. But what if the candle is more than just a beacon for the lost? What if it holds something far darker? Something that waits patiently for those who dare to uncover its secrets? In a small, isolated town tucked away in a quiet valley, there was a house that everyone knew about, not because of its size or grandeur, but because of the single candle that always burned in the window. No matter the season, no matter the weather, this candle flickered gently each night as the world around it slept in darkness. It wasn't just any candle. It was a symbol. It was a promise made long ago by a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor had been young once, full of life and hope. She had met James when they were both children, two souls bound together by a love so pure that nothing seemed capable of tearing it apart. They spent their days running through the fields, laughing under the sun, and whispering secrets to one another in the quiet corners of the town. Everyone who knew them saw the deep connection they shared. It was the kind of love that everyone believed would last forever. But then the war came. James was drafted, and with a heavy heart, he kissed Eleanor goodbye. His words echoed in her mind as he left. "I'll come back for you, Eleanor. I'll come back, and when I do, you'll be the first thing I see." Eleanor clutched his hands tightly, unable to let go. As the war raged on, the letters continued to come, each one filled with hope, love, and promises of a reunion. But as time passed, the letters grew less frequent. Then, one day, they stopped altogether. The war ended, but James never returned. Eleanor waited. She waited for weeks, months, and then years. The candle in the window was her beacon, her way of holding on to hope. The townspeople watched as she carried on, never once letting the light go out. They whispered about her, about the young woman who waited for a man who would never come home. But Eleanor didn't care about the whispers. She didn't care about the pitying glances. She loved James, and no matter how much time passed, she would wait for him. As the years stretched on, Eleanor grew older, her hair turning silver, her face lined with the passage of time. The world around her changed, but her love for James remained as strong as it ever had been. She never allowed the candle to go out. Each night, no matter how tired she was, she would rise from her chair, walk to the window, and light the candle. She believed, deep in her heart, that one day James would return. That one day, he would see the light shining for him and come back to her. But that day never came. As the decades passed, the town began to change. New families moved in, and the old houses, including Eleanor's, began to deteriorate. The townspeople had grown used to the candle in the window, seeing it as a fixture of their nightly walks. But some couldn't help but wonder what it meant. Why did Eleanor still light it after all these years? Some believed the candle had a power, that it could guide James's spirit back home, that it would help him find his way to the place he loved most. Others thought it was a way for Eleanor's soul to reach out to him, a sign that she could never let go of the love that had defined her life. But one evening, as a fierce storm rolled in and the wind howled through the town, something unusual happened. The candle, which had flickered so steadfastly for all these years, seemed to burn brighter than ever. People passing by Eleanor's house that night noticed it first. The storm raged around them, but the candle's light cut through the darkness with an unnatural intensity. It was as if the flame was alive, refusing to be extinguished by the winds or the rain. The next morning, the candle was still burning, but when the townspeople came to check on Eleanor, something was different. The house was silent. The door, which was usually cracked open, was now firmly closed. After knocking and receiving no response, they pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the house felt cold, colder than it should have been. It smelled of dust and old wood. But what caught their attention most was the figure of Eleanor. She was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, her hands still clutching the faded photograph of James. She had died in her sleep, her peaceful face reflecting the exhaustion of years spent waiting. Her eyes were closed, a faint smile on her lips as if she had finally found peace. But there was something eerie about the room. The candle in the window, which had burned for decades without fail, was now extinguished. The flame was gone, leaving only a cold emptiness in its place. And yet, in the dim light, there seemed to be a strange, almost unexplainable presence. Some of the townspeople claimed they saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, flickering in the spaces where the candle had once shone. The house was left undisturbed for days. No one dared to go near it. But one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint light appeared in the window. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a small flicker, but as the night grew darker, the light grew stronger. The candle had been relit. The flame burned brightly, as if it had never gone out. People swore that they could hear soft footsteps inside the house, like someone was walking around, waiting. Some said it was Eleanor's spirit, forever waiting for James's return. Others whispered that the candle had become something more, something far darker, an invitation to the lost souls who wandered the streets, searching for something to cling to. The legend of the candle in the window grew, and soon, the townspeople began to avoid the house entirely. But every night, without fail, the candle burns. No one knows exactly why, but there are those who believe that the house has become a threshold between the living and the dead. Some say that James's spirit still wanders the earth, searching for the woman he promised to return to. And when the wind howls and the night is dark, they claim you can see him standing in the window, staring out at the town, never quite able to cross over. Others say the candle is a sign that Eleanor, having waited so long, still watches for him, her love refusing to die. They say that when the candle finally goes out, when the last flicker of light fades away, that will be the moment when both spirits, Eleanor and James, are finally reunited. But until then, the candle burns, a solitary light in the window, a beacon for the lost, the lonely, and the forgotten. Story number 6. Have you ever walked past an old playground, its rusted swings creaking in the wind, or the faint echoes of children's laughter drifting through the air? But what if that playground wasn't just a place for fun? It was a trap, luring children into a fate from which they could never escape. A place that seems innocent at first, but is hiding a dark secret. In a quiet town, tucked away from the hustle of city life, there's an old playground. It's nothing special at first glance, just some swings, a merry-go-round, and a slide, all weathered by time. But locals know it by another name, one whispered in hushed tones. It's called the Missing Kids Playground. Every child who has ever stepped foot in this seemingly innocent place has vanished. No one knows where they went. No one can explain what happened. All that remains are the swings swaying back and forth in the breeze and the chilling silence that falls when dusk arrives. The legend surrounding the playground has haunted this town for generations. It's said that the children who go there are never seen again, and each disappearance is followed by the faint sound of laughter that seems to come from nowhere. Some say it's the spirits of the children who never left, forever trapped within the playground's boundaries, waiting for the next curious soul to enter. But is it really just a playground, or something far darker? What if the laughter you hear isn't the sound of joy, but a cry for help? Join me as we uncover the chilling tale of the missing kids' playground, a place where the innocent play, but only the darkness remains. The missing kids' playground had been abandoned for years, its swings swaying in the wind and the merry-go-round slowly turning, as though still haunted by the memories of those who used to play there. It was located at the edge of the town, a forgotten relic that most people stayed away from. Some called it a curse, others thought it was simply an abandoned piece of history, but one thing was certain: there was something terribly wrong about that place. Before it was abandoned, this playground had been a vibrant spot where children spent their afternoons, laughing, running, and playing. It was the heart of the town, a place where parents could sit on benches and watch their children in the safety of their small community. But all of that changed one summer afternoon when a child named Tommy disappeared. Tommy was no different than the other children in the town, full of energy and curiosity. He had heard the older kids talk about the playground at the edge of the town. They spoke of strange things, shadows that moved on their own, and a coldness that seemed to hang in the air even during the hottest summer days. They said that if you looked into the old slide just the right way, you could see a glimpse of another world. But Tommy, like all young children, didn't believe in stories and myths. He thought they were just tales meant to scare him. One evening, after his mother had called him in for dinner, he slipped out of the house and made his way to the playground. He didn't think much of it, just another adventure, another chance to prove that the stories were just that, stories. As soon as he stepped into the playground, he felt an odd shiver run down his spine. The air was thick and still, the only sounds being the faint creak of the swings and the distant rustling of leaves in the trees. There was no one else around. Tommy wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he definitely didn't expect the unsettling feeling that gripped him the moment he stepped onto the dusty ground. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the swings. As he approached, he noticed something strange. The swings were moving on their own, swaying gently back and forth. The air around them seemed unnaturally cold, despite the warm summer night. Tommy stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the swings as if they had a life of their own. A soft giggle echoed through the air, and Tommy's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, searching for the source of the laughter, but there was no one there. Only the dim light of the moon illuminated the empty playground. The giggle came again, this time closer. Tommy's eyes darted around, and he saw a figure standing near the edge of the jungle gym. A child, no older than he was. The child stood motionless, their back turned toward Tommy, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. "Hey," Tommy called, but the child didn't respond. He took a step forward, and then another, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The closer he got, the colder the air became, and the laughter grew louder. He could almost feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, suffocating him, but he couldn't stop himself. When Tommy reached the figure, he hesitated. There was something off about the child, something wrong. The figure's hair was dark and long, flowing in the wind, but there was something about the way they stood that felt unnatural, like they were waiting for him. Tommy stretched out his hand to touch the child's shoulder, but as soon as his fingers brushed against them, the world around him seemed to twist. A surge of cold hit him like a tidal wave, and the ground beneath him vanished. Tommy cried out, but the air around him felt thick, and his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, Tommy's parents woke up to find him missing. They searched the house, the yard, the streets, nothing. His father rushed to the playground, calling out his name, but the silence that greeted him was deafening. Tommy's mother went inside the playground, looking desperately for any sign of her son. The swings still creaked, the merry-go-round still spun slowly, but there was no sign of Tommy. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, but there was no trace of Tommy. No one knew where he had gone or what had happened. It was as though he had never existed, and the town, which had once been filled with so much life, began to grow quiet. Parents kept their children away from the playground, and the whispers about the place grew louder. It was cursed, they said. The place was haunted, they said, but no one really knew what happened, and no one dared to find out. It wasn't long before more children began to disappear. One by one, they vanished without a trace, always last seen playing near the playground. Some said they could hear their laughter in the wind, faint and distant, as though the children were still playing, even though they were gone. Others swore they saw them standing at the edge of the playground, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty, as though they were waiting for someone to rescue them. The town began to change. The once thriving community became a ghost town, with fewer and fewer families willing to stay. The playground, now overgrown with weeds and vines, remained untouched, a haunting monument to the lost children. No one dared to go near it. The swings still swayed, the merry-go-round still turned, but no one saw the children who had once played there. Years passed, and the town eventually faded into obscurity, but the playground remained, as though frozen in time, its story slowly becoming a legend. Yet, on quiet nights, when the wind howls through the trees, the sound of laughter can still be heard, faint and haunting. And if you listen closely, you might hear a child's voice whispering in the breeze, asking for help, begging to be freed from the grip of the missing kids' playground. The legend lives on, and perhaps, just maybe, there are still children who never left. They say that on certain nights, the playground calls out to those who are lost, those who are searching for adventure, those who are too curious for their own good. And when they step inside, they, too, will become part of the playground's eternal cycle, trapped, lost, and forgotten. So, if you find yourself near that old playground on a quiet, moonlit night, beware, because you might hear the faint sound of laughter calling you closer, and before you know it, you'll be the next one to vanish, never to be seen again. Story number 7. Imagine walking down a quiet street at night, the chill in the air sending shivers down your spine. Your footsteps echo in the silence, yet something feels off. It's that feeling. Someone is watching you. You glance over your shoulder, but no one is there. You shake it off, thinking it's just your mind playing tricks on you. But as you keep walking, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The feeling intensifies. It's as if someone, invisible to the eye, is following your every move. You try to tell yourself you're being paranoid, but the more you think about it, the more you feel it. That presence, that unseen observer, the invisible stranger. Who is this figure? What do they want? Why do they linger, always just out of sight? And the most chilling thought of all, what if they've been with you this entire time, hidden in plain sight, watching your every step without you ever knowing? Every glance in the mirror, every corner you turn, could they be there, just out of your line of vision? The truth is, you're not alone. Someone is always watching you, whether you want to believe it or not. But sometimes, when you finally do see them, it's far too late. The invisible stranger has been there all along. And the real question is, what happens when they decide to reveal themselves? There's a feeling we all know too well, though we might not talk about it openly. The sensation of being watched. It's an eerie, unsettling presence that creeps up on you when you least expect it. You might be alone in your room, walking down an empty street, or sitting in a crowded cafe. It doesn't matter where you are. The feeling is the same. A strange tension in the air, a subtle discomfort that something is amiss. But when you look around, there's no one there. Nothing to explain the cold sweat that suddenly breaks out on your skin. But what if that feeling is more than just paranoia? What if it's a warning? A sign that you are being watched, not by anyone you know, but by someone who is invisible to you. Someone who is always lurking, just beyond your sight. Always present, but never seen. This is the story of the invisible stranger. A force that watches from the shadows, leaving no trace, no clue as to their identity or their intentions. In a world where everything can be seen, this figure remains hidden, slipping through cracks in your awareness. They are the quiet observer, the one whose presence is felt but never acknowledged. The invisible stranger is the phantom that walks beside you, watching your every move, but never revealing themselves. Until one day, when the time is right, they might decide to step out of the shadows. As we dive into this chilling tale, prepare to feel the creeping sensation of an unseen presence, just as real as any figure in front of you. Sarah had always loved the quiet evenings when she would walk home after work, the world around her slowing down, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was a routine she had grown accustomed to, walking along the same path every night, the rhythmic click of her heels providing a comforting soundtrack to the end of her day. But tonight was different. The moment she stepped out of the train station, the usual sense of calm she felt started to fade. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with an unseen weight. It was almost as if something was pressing down on her, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't explain. She shook it off, blaming it on the tiredness of the long workday. But as she walked, the uneasy feeling didn't leave. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger, creeping into her bones and tightening around her chest. She quickened her pace, hoping to shake the feeling. But every step she took felt like it was being mirrored by someone else, someone just behind her. Her pulse began to race. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. The street was empty. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned back around, almost convinced she had seen a fleeting shadow from the corner of her eye. She paused, staring down the quiet street ahead. She told herself it was just her imagination. It had to be. No one was following her. No one was watching her. But even as she thought this, a cold chill ran down her spine, and the eerie silence around her seemed to stretch on endlessly. Sarah tried to focus on the sound of her footsteps, but it wasn't enough to drown out the growing sense of being watched. She looked around again. The street was still empty, but the feeling was undeniable. There was someone there. She could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her from the air itself. Her pace picked up, heart hammering in her chest, but the feeling followed her, an invisible presence that she couldn't shake. Every time she glanced behind her, there was nothing but empty street. But every time she turned back around, it felt like she was being watched more closely than before. She started to run, her feet pounding the pavement as she tried to outrun the overwhelming sensation of being followed. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away from whatever it was that was tracking her every move. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs moving faster than she had ever run before. But no matter how fast she went, no matter how many corners she turned, it was still there. As she reached the entrance to her apartment complex, Sarah threw herself inside, heart still racing. She slammed the door behind her and locked it. Her hands shook as she pressed her back to the door, trying to steady her breathing. She thought it was over. She thought she was safe. But that night, as she lay in her bed, the feeling didn't go away. It lingered in the room, like a dark cloud that wouldn't dissipate. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer than they should have. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, felt like something or someone was there, just out of sight. Sarah could feel it. The eyes that were always on her, watching from somewhere she couldn't see. The next day, she told herself it was just stress, maybe even exhaustion. But as the days went by, it only got worse. She was walking through her daily routine, but it was as if an invisible presence had taken root in her life. The feeling of being watched never left her. It was there when she walked to work, there when she sat at her desk, and there when she went to bed at night. One evening, while sitting in her living room, Sarah thought she heard something. A soft tapping on the window, a quiet, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking gently, asking for attention. She turned to the window. There was nothing there. She checked all around the room, her heart hammering in her chest. But everything was as it should be. The tapping had stopped. She tried to ignore it. But as soon as she went to bed that night, she felt it again. The sensation of eyes on her. This time, it was in her bedroom. She lay still, pretending to sleep, her mind racing. She turned her head slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was there. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. The whispering started, quiet at first, like the sound of a breeze rustling through the trees. Then it grew louder, a faint murmur, just beyond the edge of hearing, but there nonetheless. Soon, the word echoed through her mind, even as she tried to push it away. She lay there, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. The whisper came again, more forcefully this time. Soon, she shot up in bed, her eyes wide with panic. What did it mean? Who was saying it? And why couldn't she see them? The days dragged on, and with each one, the invisible stranger's presence seemed to grow. At work, she'd feel the weight of someone's stare, even when no one was near her. Walking down the street, she'd feel eyes following her from every shadow. She tried to go about her life, pretending nothing was wrong, but she knew deep down that something was horribly amiss. Then, one night, it happened. She stepped out of her apartment building, feeling that familiar, suffocating sensation of being watched. She tried to calm herself. It was just her mind, she thought, but as she walked, it grew stronger. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but no one was there. She found herself turning down a street she didn't recognize. A dark alleyway, the streetlights flickering and barely illuminating the path ahead. The air was thick, pressing in on her, and the sense of being followed was overwhelming. She couldn't run. Her legs felt frozen to the ground. And then, a voice whispered from somewhere deep in the shadows. "You're mine now." Sarah felt the breath leave her body as she spun around, but no one was there. She could hear the sound of breathing, slow and deep, coming from all around her. It was like the world itself was closing in on her, and she was trapped in the silence of the invisible stranger. When she turned to leave, the street was gone. The buildings, the streetlights, even the pavement, all vanished. The only thing left was the suffocating dark and the whisper that had followed her for so long. Soon, the feeling of being watched never left, and Sarah realized too late that it never would. The invisible stranger had claimed her, not by touch, but by the suffocating weight of their unseen presence, their watchful eyes, always on her. She had become part of their story now, another figure lost in the shadows, watched by someone who would never be seen. And she was never alone again. Story number 8. The story of the music box's tune begins long ago, in a time and place shrouded in whispers and shadows. The music box, passed down through generations, was an heirloom of a once prominent family, renowned for their wealth and influence. But their legacy took a dark turn when the family became entangled with the mysterious origins of the box. It wasn't just an ordinary music box, with its delicate carvings and soft, tinkling melody. No, this box held something far more sinister. A curse, one that had claimed the lives of those who came into contact with it. The box was created by a craftsman whose name has been lost to time. Legend has it that he was a man of extraordinary skill, a master of his craft, who once lived in a quiet village on the edge of a great forest. He made the music box for his beloved, a woman he adored with all his heart. It was to be a token of his love, a song that would remind her of his devotion. But as with many love stories, tragedy struck. His beloved, while walking through the forest one evening, vanished without a trace. Some say she was taken by the forest spirit. Others say it was the work of a rival. Regardless, she was never seen again, and the craftsman was left heartbroken. Desperate to cope with his grief, he turned to the box. He crafted a melody, a lullaby, one that he hoped would bring peace to his tortured soul. It was a haunting tune, delicate and slow, with notes that echoed in the heart like the soft pull of a distant memory. But what he didn't know was that the box wasn't just a piece of art. The melody, when played, wasn't just a simple song. It was a ritual, a calling, a power. It had been cursed long before it had ever touched his hands. As the craftsman began to play the box, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss and longing. But he also felt something else, something darker. The music seemed to wrap around him, pulling him deeper into despair, until one night, as the lullaby played, he disappeared. His body was never found. The house was left abandoned, the music box sitting alone in the center of a forgotten room. Years passed, and the music box changed hands, passed down from one person to the next. Each new owner of the box would hear the haunting melody and feel a deep sense of peace. But that peace would never last. The box had a strange power, one that drew people in, making them listen to the music for longer and longer. And once the tune reached its peak, once the melody played its final note, the listener would vanish, gone without a trace. No one could explain it, but it became a quiet, whispered legend in the small towns where the box appeared, always vanishing again just as mysteriously as it had arrived. One such victim was Clara, a young woman in her 20s, who had recently moved into a new home on the edge of town. She had heard the stories, of course, everyone had, but she dismissed them as nothing more than superstition, local myths meant to scare children. One evening, after a long day at work, Clara walked home in the quiet of the night. As she passed an old, dilapidated house, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. A soft, distant melody, like the tinkling of a lullaby, floated through the night air. It was faint at first, but it seemed to beckon her. Intrigued, Clara followed the sound, her feet moving on their own, as if drawn by some unseen force. She arrived at the house where the sound seemed to originate, the door creaking open without a sound. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with dust, and the air smelled stale. The music played, almost like a whisper, coming from a room deep within the house. Clara, trembling with a mix of curiosity and dread, followed the sound, each step taking her closer to the source. She found the room where the music played, a small, dimly lit space with a single object in the center, the music box. It was old, beautiful, and strange. She couldn't explain it, but something about the box felt familiar, as though she had seen it before, in a dream or a memory she couldn't place. Unable to resist, Clara reached for the box, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface. As soon as she touched it, the music grew louder, more insistent. She turned the key, and the lullaby filled the room. It was enchanting, like a melody from another world. Her body relaxed, her mind cleared, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace. But as the notes played, something shifted. The room seemed to grow darker, the edges of her vision blurring. The music began to warp, stretching the melody, each note becoming a pull, a tug that seemed to draw her closer to the edge of something. Something empty, something terrifying. She tried to move, but her body refused to listen. She tried to stop the music, but her hands were frozen, unable to break free from the box. The lullaby grew louder and louder, as if it were feeding on her very soul, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The air around her thickened, the silence between the notes suffocating. Clara's body felt heavy, and her mind became clouded, filled only with the song. It was no longer just music. It was the final call, a melody that would erase her from the world. The moment the last note played, the house fell silent. The box sat still, as though nothing had ever happened. But Clara was gone. Her body vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of her existence. Her friends searched for her for weeks, but all they found was the empty house and the music box, its tune still faintly playing in the distance. They never found her, and they never found anyone else who had been taken by the box. Time passed, and the music box continued its endless cycle, always waiting, always seeking new souls to claim. It wasn't just a melody. It was a curse, a call to those who were lost, to those who felt empty inside. It played, and those who heard it would never leave. They became part of the song, lost to the world, their lives nothing more than a forgotten memory. Story number 9. The elevator doors close with a soft hiss, the kind that seems ordinary, almost reassuring. You press the button for your floor, the one you've pressed 100 times before. The familiar hum of the machine starts up, but then it happens. The elevator lurches unnaturally, like it's skipping over something. But what? You glance up at the floor display. 4, 5, 6, 8. Wait, 8? That's not your floor. You look back at the number panel, expecting to see your floor number, but it's nowhere to be found. The elevator continues to descend, but you're not sure where to. The lights flicker for a second, then dim as the elevator jerks again. This time, it's more forceful, enough to make you feel off balance. Your stomach flips as you grip the railing, trying to steady yourself. A moment of panic sets in, but before you can react, the elevator slows to a halt. The doors open with a soft, almost welcoming chime. But what you see on the other side isn't what you were expecting. It's not the floor you know, the one you've seen 1,000 times. The hallway stretches out, too quiet, too sterile. The carpet is an old, worn pattern, and the walls are a dull shade of gray. There's a faint smell in the air, dusty and stagnant. It's as if this floor hasn't been touched in years. You step out hesitantly, unsure if you've entered a part of the building you've never noticed before. You glance back at the elevator, but the doors close before you can reach them. The elevator, now gone, has left you behind in a place that doesn't feel right, a place that doesn't even feel like it belongs in the building. You glance around again, your mind racing. There's no sound, no hum of machines, not even the usual buzz of fluorescent lights, just an eerie silence that weighs heavily on your chest. You begin walking down the hall, hoping to find some sort of clue, something that explains why you're here. The hall stretches on further than you remember. You check the time on your phone, only to find the battery drained, as if the elevator itself had drained the power from your device. The hallway seems to be growing longer, twisting and winding, but it's eerily still, as though frozen in time. The smell of dampness fills the air, thickening as you walk further. Every step you take is met with an oppressive sense of unease. You pause, hearing something faint, something that doesn't belong. Footsteps. You turn quickly, but no one's there. The shadows cast by the dim light seem to shift on their own, as though something is moving just beyond your reach. You feel it then, the undeniable sensation of being watched. Your skin prickles, your heart begins to race. A cold breeze rushes past you, though there's no open window, no way for it to come in. And then, as if on cue, you hear a sound from behind you, a soft, mechanical whirring. You spin around and find yourself facing the elevator doors again. But this time, the elevator isn't just there. It's waiting. The doors open slowly, as if inviting you back inside. But there's something about it that makes you hesitate. The dim light from the elevator doesn't feel like it's coming from the usual bulbs. It's cold, almost like moonlight, unnatural. You step closer, drawn by something you can't explain. Maybe it's the need to escape, to find something familiar. But as you approach, you notice the interior of the elevator isn't like the usual lift either. It's almost wrong. The walls are darker than they should be, the air heavier. You step inside, trying to convince yourself it's just your imagination, just the odd experience of an old building playing tricks on you. But as the doors close, you feel a knot in your stomach. It's not the same elevator. The doors close with a loud clang, and the elevator begins to move, but there's no sound, no hum, no familiar rise or fall. It's as if you're being pulled somewhere beyond the building, beyond the limits of what's real. The lights flicker again, and for a brief second, you see a flash of something in the corner of your eye, a face that isn't yours. The elevator shakes again, then stops. The doors open slowly, and you step out into a place that feels far removed from the world you know. The air is thick, colder. The walls are cracked, peeling, and outside, you hear something. The sound of whispers, as if you're not alone. A voice calls your name, but you can't pinpoint where it's coming from. You feel yourself drawn deeper into the unknown. Every corner feels like it's closing in on you, the pressure mounting. You turn back to the elevator, but it's already gone, leaving you in the silence of a place where time no longer has meaning. The only thing that remains is the overwhelming sensation of being watched, the presence of something far older than you, something that has claimed this space. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of that building, the elevator waits for the next passenger. Someone else to take its ride, someone else to vanish into the places that should never be. You may never leave this place, but the elevator will always be there, waiting for the next lost soul. And once you enter, you will never escape. Story number 10. Imagine a night where the moon isn't just any moon. It's blood red, casting an eerie crimson glow across the sky. The air grows thick, heavier, like something is breathing in the darkness. And then, as the night deepens, something even stranger happens. Creatures, unlike anything you've ever seen, begin to roam the earth. But here's the question. What happens when the blood moon rises? What if it's not just a natural phenomenon, but a ritual, one that awakens forces beyond human understanding? Creatures, monsters, spirits, they're not just legends on nights like this. They're real, roaming freely, their eyes glowing under the blood-red sky. This is no ordinary night. This is the night when the world as we know it takes on a new form, a night when the veil between the living and the dead grows thin, a night when ancient rituals come alive, and beings from beyond step out into the world. Now, imagine yourself caught in the middle of it all. The eerie silence of the night is broken only by distant growls, whispers, and the howling winds. And you just know, that when the blood moon rises, there's no turning back. The ritual begins, and there's no escape until it's over. Will you survive the night? Or will the creatures of the blood moon claim you too? On this particular night, the moon was more than just a celestial body. It was a signal, a warning, and a call. The blood moon had begun to rise, bathing the earth in an unnatural, red light. As the shadows grew longer, the air itself seemed to shift. Something ancient stirred, deep in the heart of the earth, stirring creatures that had long remained hidden from the world. That night, the veil between worlds was thinner than ever, and the creatures that roamed under the cover of darkness weren't just myths or stories passed down through generations. They were real, and they were coming. It's said that the blood moon is more than a rare occurrence. It's the night when ancient rituals are set into motion, rituals that awaken beings from the deepest corners of the earth and beyond. These creatures, not bound by the rules of the day or night, roam free under the moon's red gaze, their eyes glowing like fiery embers. The once-in-a-lifetime event has come, and the creatures are hungry. But here's the thing. If you're caught outside when the ritual begins, you might find yourself at the mercy of these ancient beings as they stalk the land, searching for those brave or foolish enough to challenge the blood moon's power. What will happen on this fateful night when the creatures of the blood moon begin their hunt? Will you survive their terrifying ritual, or will you become just another story for the next generation? Stay tuned, because tonight's story is one you won't want to miss if you dare. The blood moon hung high in the sky, casting its crimson glow across the land, bathing everything in an eerie, unsettling light. It wasn't just another full moon. This was a night that had been whispered about for generations, a night when the boundary between the living and the dead thinned, allowing creatures from the darkest corners of the world to roam freely. People spoke in hushed tones about the ancient ritual that took place every year on the blood moon night, a ritual that called forth strange beings, ones that had long since been forgotten by history but were never entirely gone. They had been waiting, biding their time. In the small village at the edge of the forest, the signs of the blood moon's arrival were unmistakable. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of something ancient. The temperature dropped sharply, despite it being the peak of summer. The birds had long since fallen silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to move. The villagers knew better than to venture outside when the moon was this red. But there were always the curious ones, the ones who dared to challenge fate. The first to disappear was young Elias, a boy no older than 17. He had always been drawn to the strange, the mysterious, the forbidden. His friends warned him not to go out that night, to stay indoors where it was safe. But Elias scoffed at their fears, thinking the stories were nothing more than superstition. As the moon rose higher in the sky, he made his way to the woods, where the whispers said the ritual began. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with energy, a low hum that vibrated through the air, making his skin crawl. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but the darkness of the forest was thicker than usual, as if the trees themselves were watching him. As Elias ventured deeper into the woods, he began to hear soft whispers on the wind. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but as he walked further, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel an unnatural chill in the air. Then, suddenly, he stopped. There was a figure standing just beyond the tree line, its shape shrouded in shadow. It stood perfectly still, facing him. The figure didn't move, didn't even blink. Elias felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His breath hitched, but something deep inside him urged him forward. As he took a step closer, the figure slowly turned its head, revealing eyes that glowed with a deep red light, just like the blood moon. Elias's feet froze to the ground, his body unwilling to move. The whispers had turned into a low, guttural chant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He tried to scream, to run, but his voice was swallowed by the night. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnatural, jerking and twitching like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Then, in the blink of an eye, the creature lunged at Elias, disappearing into the shadows with him, taking him without a sound. Back in the village, his friends waited for him to return, but the hours passed, and Elias never came back. They waited for days, thinking he had simply wandered off or gotten lost. But when they ventured into the woods to search for him, they found only his torn clothes, his belongings scattered across the forest floor, and the ground around them seemed wrong. The soil was disturbed, as if something had been dragged through it. The whispers seemed louder here, more urgent, calling them deeper into the woods. It didn't take long before the others began to disappear. One by one, the villagers were drawn to the call of the blood moon. They couldn't resist it, even though they knew the risks. The creatures that were said to emerge on this night were hungry, and they only fed on fear. The more frightened a person became, the more powerful these creatures became. They fed on the terror of their victims, growing stronger with every soul they consumed. As the night progressed, the creatures grew bolder. They moved through the village, slipping in and out of shadows, their eyes glowing with a sickly red light. The villagers who had stayed inside were not safe. The creatures were always watching, always listening, slipping in through cracks and open windows. They whispered in the dark, calling to those inside, beckoning them into the night. Some heard their voices but couldn't find the source. Others saw shadows moving just outside their windows but dared not look too closely. The ritual was not just about feeding. It was about control. The creatures were part of something older, something far more powerful. With each passing blood moon, they grew stronger, their grip tightening on the village, their presence growing more overwhelming. The villagers knew that if they didn't stop the ritual, they would all be consumed, body and soul. In the center of the village, an ancient stone altar had stood for centuries, forgotten by most. The elders had once spoken of it, warning the people to never disturb it. It was said to be the site of the ritual, where the creatures drew their power, where the veil between worlds was thinnest. This altar was the heart of the ritual, and only by destroying it could the cycle be broken. A small group of survivors, those who had not yet succumbed to the blood moon's call, gathered together to make their final stand. Armed with nothing but their courage and the knowledge passed down through generations, they approached the altar. As they did, the ground trembled, and the creatures closed in, their glowing eyes watching from every corner, from every shadow. They were almost upon them when they reached the altar. With a final, desperate prayer, one of them raised a ceremonial blade and struck the stone altar. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the world seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The ground split open, and a rush of cold air poured from the cracks. The creatures shrieked in agony, their forms beginning to fade as the veil between worlds collapsed. The survivors watched as the creatures vanished into the night, their glowing eyes fading into nothingness. The blood moon slowly began to wane, and with it, the curse lifted. But the cost was high. The village was forever scarred, its people lost to the night, taken by the creatures who fed on fear. And even though the ritual had ended, there were whispers in the wind, a warning to those who dared to listen. The blood moon would return, and with it, the creatures would rise again. Thank you for joining us for today's chilling tales. If you enjoyed these stories, please make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to share the video. Your feedback means the world to us. If you want more spine-tingling stories, be sure to subscribe to Muzi Horror World so you never miss our next eerie tale. Stay curious, stay brave, and until next time, sleep tight if you can.